Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Today's video is a tactical one for Italian Renaissance era historical fencing. So I want to describe to you when it is safe to launch an attack on the opponent during a bout. And I'm going to adapt some of the theory of Giovanni dall'Agocchie's writings, and this is from more or less the same time as Di Grassi. So I'm going to adapt dall'Agocchie's theory to the Di Grassi style, but really this concept of when it's safe to attack is applicable to basically all fencing. So dall'Agocchie says that there are 5 tempi, or times, when it is safe to attack. Number 1, after you parry. Number 2, when the opponent's sword passes outside your body. Number 3, when the opponent raises his hand to attack. Number 4, when the opponent changes guard. And number 5, when the opponent takes a step forwards. Now, there are some important details in the definitions of these, so I'm going to go through them one by one to make everything clear for you now. Okay, so the first tempo when it's safe to attack is after you parry. So from a Di Grassi point of view, your opponent has launched some kind of attack. You have parried by deflecting the opponent's sword and taking a little step to the side. At this point, the opponent's energy is expended. They have moved themselves into measure in order to try to reach you, and the tip of their sword will be displaced, making no threat to you. So you have a time, a tempo, to strike the opponent with a riposte. So that is the simplest and I think most obvious tempo when it's safe to attack. The opponent's attack has been stopped, dead or deflected by your defense, and then bam, you can go with a riposte. Okay, the second tempo when it's safe to attack is a little more complex to explain. So dall'Agocchie says that when your opponent's sword passes outside of your body, then you can make an attack of your own. And what does that mean? So, in a system like Di Grassi's, where the guard stance is like so, with the tip of the sword threatening the opponent, the tip is almost the first defense that you have. Your opponent can't come running straight at you because they need to worry about the threat of impalement on your sword. So, anytime you see your opponent's tip is no longer looking at you, you can then take the tempo to attack into this space here, with the idea that the opponent needs to realign their tip before they can attack you with a thrust. Now, this can happen for a number of reasons. Firstly, the opponent may just have a bad guard, so they may just move their sword out to the side or hold their sword out to the side, like this, for example, in which case, in you go. Secondly, you can perform an action on their blade to make their sword pass outside of your body. In other words, no longer be aiming at you. You can do this with pressure opposing their blade, so finding their sword, just to push the tip aside. Or you can do it more aggressively with a beat, striking their blade and forcing it aside, either with your own sword or with your offhand or with a companion weapon, however you want to do it. Another possibility is that you use footwork in order to adjust your own position so that you're no longer in front of their sword. If you're fast, you can do it simply by stepping off to the side, or when the opponent attacks, with a thrust for example, you can slip off to the side, dodging their blow, and therefore their sword has passed outside of your body, and you have the tempo to make a thrust. So in fact, there are actually lots of subcategories to this one. But basically, anytime the opponent's tip becomes displaced and is no longer aiming at you, you have a tempo to step in and attack. Now, a quick word of warning, there is an exception to this one. If your opponent practices a very cut-oriented style of fencing and is stood on guard in an open ward with their sword prepared to strike, something like this overhead guard, for example, you should be very careful. This is not truly a tempo which is safe for you because their sword is ready to descend quickly and powerfully at the moment you attack. So that's an exception to this rule. Okay, the third tempo, when it's safe for you to attack, is when the opponent raises their sword hand in order to perform a strike. So let's imagine somebody's stood on guard in Degrassi's low ward and they want to launch a cut at you and they raise their hand like this. Now is your tempo to go. So at the moment they are raising their hand to prepare the attack, but before the attack has begun to unfold, you can strike. The reason for that is that the opponent's weapon and the guard of their weapon is moving away from you and creating an open space. If the cut has already begun, then it's much more difficult to make an attack safely. So it's important to try to go as soon as possible. Bear in mind that this also applies to an opponent who's trying to perform a beat, because a beat is nothing other than a cut directed at the blade of your own sword. The tempo might be smaller because the action will typically be smaller than a cut aimed at your head, for example, but there is still technically a tempo for you to go within that action. Okay, dall'Agocchie's tempo number 4, when it is safe to attack, is when your opponent changes guard. For example, perhaps they are stood on guard in Degrassi's low ward and they decide they want to change to broad ward for some reason. So here's broad ward. So they start in low ward, they move to broad ward, and bam, here is your tempo to go. Now, we should note that this is only a tempo for you to attack if the opponent foolishly decides to make this guard change in measure with you. For this very reason, many masters advocate only changing guard posture when you are safely out of measure with the opponent. So, when the opponent decides to change guard within measure, there is a tempo there. And the tempo is created, once again, by the movement of the opponent's weapon, because at this point, when they begin moving, the weapon is engaged in lateral motion and is not available for the opponent to strike you, and therefore you are able to take advantage of that by making your attack safely without danger of counterattack. Okay, tempo number 5 is when the opponent takes a step forwards in order to close measure with you. So the opponent might be on guard like this, and then they advance a foot to try to close measure, and this is the tempo. Now, let's be more specific. The tempo arises when the opponent lifts their foot and begins to transfer their weight forwards. When their motion is completed, when they're here, the tempo is gone, because in this position, the opponent is stable and ready to fight. So they are able to make a counter thrust or some other defensive action. But at the moment when they're just beginning to move, they are very slightly off balance, their defense is slightly disrupted, and you have a tempo to get in there and strike them. dall'Agocchie notes that there is a much better tempo to achieve this if the opponent is moving with their front foot. If the opponent is moving their back foot in the manner recommended by Degrassi, there is technically a tempo, but it's very small. So the opponent's front foot movement is really the best tempo for taking advantage of this. And that was the last of our list of 5 tempi when it is safe to attack according to dall'Agocchie. Okay, so to conclude, these 5 tempi which dall'Agocchie described in his treatise are an attempt to codify or rationalize a very complex topic. Obviously, in a real full-speed free fencing exchange, it can be very difficult to measure out and think through these possibilities. But with training, you can start to recognize when your opponent makes superfluous movements. And that's really what this list is trying to teach you. Anytime the opponent makes a move which they shouldn't, there's an opportunity, a tempo for you to then launch a quick attack when it's very difficult or possibly impossible for them to defend themselves. So it's a very interesting tactical concept to go away and think about, and perhaps to introduce to your own free fencing when you next have the opportunity to train in that way with a partner. So I'll finish there for today. Take care, everyone. See you soon. Bye.